Madagascar's President Andry Rajoelina has fled the country aboard a French military aircraft, according to the French radio RFI's reporting on Monday. The embattled leader was reportedly flown out following a deal brokered with French President Emmanuel Macron as political crisis deepens in the island nation. NTV's Catherine Omanto reports that the escape is not enough for the angered people of Madagascar.
Madagascar didn't fall. It woke up. What the world called a coup was really a verdict. A nation tired of watching its leaders dine in Paris while its children starved in Antananarivo finally stood up. When the lights went out and the taps ran dry, the silence broke. The youth, born into promises but fed on excuses, decided obedience was no longer a virtue. And when the army put down its guns and walked beside them, the old order collapsed overnight. This wasn't chaos. It was clarity, the moment Madagascar remembered who it belonged to. But what is really going on? Let's find out. It began quietly, as most revolutions do, not with a gunshot, but with a power cut. One more blackout in a city already used to darkness. But this time, something felt different. The silence in Antananarivo wasn't the usual resignation. It was a pause before impact. The lights went out, and the country realized it had been living in the dark for too long, not just without electricity, but without leadership, without justice, without hope. For months, the streets had whispered of collapse. Families spent nights by candlelight, their food spoiling in powerless refrigerators, while government ministers gave televised speeches from air-conditioned offices powered by private generators. The divide between ruler and ruled had grown so obscene that even the poor stopped believing in fate. They began believing in change. By early October 2025, the tension had become a drumbeat. The price of water had tripled. Unemployment strangled the youth, and the state's promises of reform had turned into a hollow ritual. But it wasn't policy failure that broke the people, it was humiliation. Madagascar's president, Andry Rajoelina, a man who once paraded himself as the modernizer, was exposed as something far older and uglier, a symbol of dependency. He carried a French passport as comfortably as his presidential one. To many, he wasn't just a corrupt leader. He was a reminder that the country had never truly left the colonial table. That dual citizenship became a moral wound. Every blackout reminded the people that their nation's power, literal and political, was always plugged into France. Every empty tap reminded them of foreign deals that exported wealth and imported debt. By the time protesters first gathered outside government offices, they weren't shouting for better governance. They were shouting for liberation. The demonstrations began with university students, the children of the internet, who had nothing left to lose but their Wi-Fi connection. They carried cardboard signs that read, "We don't need donations, we need dignity." Within days, taxi drivers, factory workers, and school teachers joined them. The movement grew not because it was organized, but because it was honest. And yet, even as crowds swelled, Rajoelina's government mocked them. Ministers appeared on television, blaming foreign agitators, as if the people needed outsiders to teach them their own hunger. But the arrogance backfired. Every insult thrown at the youth only confirmed what they already knew, that the state no longer served the people, it served itself. Then came the day that broke the facade. Parliament, weary of corruption and public anger, voted to impeach Rajoelina. The president, in a final act of desperation, tried to dissolve Parliament before the papers were signed. That was the fatal misstep. The Constitution cracked under the pressure, and into that fracture stepped Colonel Michael Randrianirina, the disciplined, silent commander of the elite CAPSAT unit. The same soldiers who had once elevated Rajoelina to power now watched him dismantle the law to save himself. For them, loyalty to a man ended where loyalty to the nation began. As the capital roared with protest, the army began to move, not against the people, but toward them. When the tanks appeared on the streets of Antananarivo, no one screamed, no one ran. Instead, they applauded. The soldiers stood beside the demonstrators, guarding them against the very police meant to suppress them. And in that moment, the revolution changed character. It was no longer the people against the state. It was the people reclaiming the state. By midnight, power lines were still dead, but a different kind of light filled the city. the glow of cell phone screens recording history in real time. As rumors spread that Rajoelina had fled the palace, the crowds erupted. Some wept, some sang. But everyone understood one thing: Madagascar wasn't collapsing. It was finally standing up. That night, the world called it a coup. But to those in the streets, it was something deeper, a homecoming of power. And the question that lingered beneath the celebration was the same one on every continent watching from afar. If this is how it begins, what happens when an entire generation decides to never go back? Revolutions don't appear out of nowhere. They mature quietly inside those who've been denied too long. When the streets of Madagascar lit up with the energy of defiance, it wasn't just because the people were angry, it was because an entire generation finally stopped pretending patience was a virtue. The blackouts, the empty taps, the hollow promises, they were merely sparks. What truly ignited the country was a generational realization that obedience had become the language of decay. The youth of Madagascar, the same ones mocked as lazy dreamers by the political elite, became the architects of a movement that no party or politician could claim. They called themselves Gen Z Madagascar, not as a trend, but as a statement. They were born after the revolutions of the 2000s, raised in an age of hashtags, misinformation, and disillusionment. They had grown up watching old men make speeches about progress while their own schools crumbled. They'd seen their parents queue for fuel, work without pay, and apologize for a nation that never gave them anything to be proud of. But Gen Z was different. They had the internet. They had eyes on the world, and they saw what life could be elsewhere. The gap between possibility and reality became unbearable. Every tweet from Paris showing bright city lights reminded them that their own capital was sinking into darkness. Every global post about human rights was mocked by its own government's censorship. For the first time in decades, the youth didn't just feel poor, they felt insulted. The movement began with small circles, university forums, online spaces, and group chats. But what made it unstoppable was its humility. It wasn't led by celebrities or career activists. It was led by young engineers, students, nurses, and unemployed graduates, people who lived the failures they were fighting against. They organized not through speeches, but through solidarity. When the government banned protests in the capital, the youth didn't retreat. They scattered across the country, turning every town square into a mirror of rebellion. It was strategic, not chaotic. They had studied the movements in Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Sudan. They understood how to make the regime fear exposure more than confrontation. So instead of burning buildings, they recorded evidence. They uploaded videos of police beatings, of water trucks diverted to elite neighborhoods, of children drinking from muddy wells. They didn't just accuse the state of failure, they showed it. And while the world debated whether Madagascar's protests were democratic, the young people never wasted breath on definitions. They weren't fighting for Western approval. They were fighting to own their destiny. When the international press tried to describe them as disillusioned, one student leader replied online, "We're not disillusioned, we're done being polite." That line spread faster than the government could delete it. What connected every protester wasn't ideology, it was hunger. Hunger not just for food, but for control. They wanted to decide who spoke for them. They wanted to end the insult of leaders who smiled in Paris while their people begged in the markets. To them, Rajoelina's French passport was more than a scandal. It was proof that he governed like a visitor in his own country. As the crowds grew, the police were ordered to suppress them. But that's when the movement evolved again. The youth didn't just resist, they outsmarted. They changed meeting points at the last minute, shared real-time routes through encrypted apps, and live-streamed police movements. Within days, the government lost its monopoly on truth. For the first time in decades, Madagascar's people could see their state in full view, and it wasn't pretty. And yet, amid the chaos, there was a strange calm. The young protesters weren't asking for revenge. They were asking for renewal. They didn't want to destroy the country. They wanted to rebuild it on their own terms. Their chants weren't angry. They were deliberate, almost spiritual. They shouted, "We will not accept anymore." By the second week, their numbers had swelled beyond counting. The government's televised denials looked absurd next to the footage circulating online. It wasn't just a protest now. It was a social reckoning, a generational demand that Madagascar grow up or get out of the way. And as the world watched, one question began to rise in every newsroom, every embassy, every living room. If the youth could bring the streets to life, what would happen when the soldiers began to listen? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. For weeks, the army had stood as the unspoken variable. The protesters knew it, the politicians feared it, and the president pretended it didn't exist. In every African uprising, there comes a moment when the crowd looks toward the barracks, wondering which way the rifles will turn. In Madagascar, that moment arrived with breathtaking clarity and quiet courage. The soldiers had been watching. They had seen the blackout nights, the dry taps, the tear gas mornings. They weren't immune to it. Their own families were out there in the same streets. Their wives queued for bread, their children studied by candlelight, and their paychecks, like everyone else's, shrank with every new government contract signed in Paris. The divide between the people and the army had never been cultural. It was only circumstantial. When the president's orders began to sound less like discipline and more like self-preservation, the line of loyalty began to blur. Inside the military, whispers turned into questions. Could they really open fire on unarmed students? Could they defend a man who fled accountability by dissolving the very parliament meant to represent the people? Every oath has its breaking point. For the soldiers of Capsat, the elite unit once loyal to Rajoelina, that point had arrived. Colonel Andry Rajoelina wasn't an opportunist. He was a realist. He understood something the politicians never could, that stability doesn't come from fear, it comes from respect. When the chain of command becomes a leash, the army loses its honor. And so, one morning, without fanfare or bloodshed, he issued a statement that rippled through every rank and every radio. The military would no longer protect corruption. The declaration hit the capital like thunder. Suddenly, checkpoints melted away. Soldiers left their posts to escort demonstrators safely through the streets. Barracks, once used to detain protesters, opened their gates to shelter them. Tanks rolled out, not toward the people, but beside them, forming a moving wall of protection between citizens and police loyalists. It was discipline redefined, not the obedience of force, but the obedience of conscience. Inside the presidential palace, panic set in. Rajoelina's inner circle urged him to make concessions, but power built on dependency doesn't know how to retreat, only how to deny. He called emergency meetings, issued televised warnings, and even tried to reach out to Paris for mediation. But his calls were met with silence. France, it seemed, had no appetite for another scandal bearing its fingerprints. When word spread that he might seek asylum abroad, the symbolism became unbearable. The man accused of ruling for France was now fleeing to France. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Antananarivo was unlike any in its history, a strange, electric peace. The protesters didn't cheer the army as heroes. They treated them as equals. Young people offered water to soldiers, and soldiers lifted the elderly onto trucks to get them home safely. It wasn't unity born of ideology. It was unity born of fatigue. Everyone had simply had enough of pretending the system could still work. As night fell, the city stood in suspended breath. The national television station, long a mouthpiece of the regime, went off air. Then, minutes later, it flickered back. But this time, the message was different. Colonel Andry Rajoelina appeared, not in uniformed arrogance but in deliberate calm. Behind him stood officers from multiple divisions, representing a consensus that cut across factions and tribes. The army will ensure a peaceful transition, he announced, until the people choose their own path. It was not the speech of a usurper. It was the statement of a soldier reclaiming meaning in service. No shots, no smoke, no martyrdom, just the simple act of withdrawal from tyranny. That restraint was revolutionary in itself. By dawn, the president had vanished. Reports later confirmed his departure on a French military aircraft, a detail that turned whispers of foreign loyalty into undeniable truth. As the sun rose over the capital, citizens lined the streets, waving flags and chanting the same phrase again and again. We have no enemies left, only work to do. The coup, if one insists on calling it that, was unlike any before it. It wasn't the conquest of power, it was the evacuation of corruption. Madagascar had not been seized, it had been released. And yet, as the dust settled, a deeper question surfaced, one that would decide whether this victory became a milestone or a mirage. Now that the old order was gone, could this unity survive the weight of rebuilding? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Every revolution sends out a sound wave. Some fade before they reach the shore. Others travel across continents. Madagascar's uprising did not echo softly. It reverberated across Africa like a drumbeat announcing a generational shift. What began as a rebellion against one leader quickly became a lesson in what happens when an entire continent grows weary of borrowed systems, borrowed ideas, and borrowed power. In the days following Rajoelina's fall, something remarkable happened. Across African capitals, conversations turned from how Madagascar fell to why it had to. Political commentators called it a warning from the Indian Ocean, but on the streets of Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Conakry, young people understood it as something deeper, a validation of everything they had been shouting for years. Africa does not need permission to breathe. For too long, nations had traded their autonomy for approval. They had been told stability mattered more than justice, that elections mattered more than integrity, that being a good ally mattered more than being an honest state. But the Malagasy coup, or correction as its people called it, shattered that illusion. It proved that no constitution, however Western approved, could survive once the governed stopped consenting to humiliation. The symbolism of Rajoelina's departure was impossible to ignore. His escape on a French military jet became an image replayed in newsrooms from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. It wasn't just the fall of a president, it was a metaphor for the quiet colonialism still pulsing through Africa's veins. For decades, leaders with foreign passports had ruled countries with domestic poverty, hiding behind aid deals that starved independence. Madagascar exposed that arrangement for what it truly was, a transaction of obedience. And yet, the rebellion didn't inspire anger, it inspired imitation. Activists from neighboring nations began invoking the Madagascar model, a revolt that succeeded not by violence, but by coherence. It was proof that when people and soldiers stand for the same truth, even the most entrenched system collapses without a single explosion. African youth movements, already simmering with frustration, suddenly had a case study, not in theory, but in practice. Still, what gave the Malagasy uprising its weight wasn't just what it overthrew, it was what it revealed. It showed that dependency is the new dictatorship. You can change presidents, rewrite constitutions, hold endless elections, but if your national budget is drafted in Washington or Paris, your independence is ornamental. The youth across the continent understood that immediately. They saw in Madagascar's defiance a mirror of their own future struggles, not for flags or songs, but for control of their economies, their land, their story. Meanwhile, Western analysts were quick to label the event as a democratic setback, but Africans had learned to read such labels in reverse. What the West calls instability often means disobedience. What it calls radicalism often means self-respect. To the new generation, the Malagasy revolt wasn't an erosion of democracy, it was its resurrection. Because democracy without dignity is just a ceremonial cage. The question now lingered across the continent like a challenge. Was this the beginning of a continental awakening? From the Sahel's military realignments to East Africa's growing skepticism of foreign contracts, the signs were aligning. Madagascar wasn't just another country in crisis. It had become the newest chapter in Africa's long argument with dependency. And yet, no revolution is safe from itself. The people had won back their country, but the harder task was only beginning, transforming anger into architecture, symbolism into substance. Could this fragile unity between youth, soldiers, and citizens survive the long winter of governance that follows every fire? Revolutions are easy to romanticize at night, when the chants are loud, the flags wave high, and history feels close enough to touch. But dawn always asks the harder question, what now? When the streets of Antananarivo finally quieted, when the slogans began to fade into ordinary air, Madagascar faced the hardest part of every revolution, not the fall of the old order, but the birth of something better. The soldiers who had stood beside the people now had to become guardians, not rulers. The youth who had shouted for justice now had to decide what justice looked like in practice. The Transitional Council, hastily assembled by officers, civic leaders, and technocrats, promised a 2-year roadmap towards civilian rule, economic reform, and institutional rebuilding. But the people, wiser now, refused to surrender their vigilance. They had learned the oldest lesson of power. Freedom is not given. It is borrowed every day from those willing to defend it. Madagascar in the weeks after the coup was unrecognizable. The fear that had once ruled the streets had evaporated. In its place came something raw and uncertain, an energy that felt both fragile and unshakable. Civil servants began showing up to work earlier. State-run media, once a chorus of praise for the presidency, started hosting open debates about corruption. University students, the same ones who had led the marches, began drafting community proposals for electricity projects and local cooperatives. The revolution had turned into participation. The transitional government understood it was being watched, not just by the international community, but by its own citizens. There would be no blind faith this time. Every promise was weighed, every action recorded. The first major step came within weeks, a national audit of foreign contracts signed under Rajoelina's rule. The findings were explosive. Dozens of energy, mining, and infrastructure agreements had been tilted heavily in favor of French corporations, draining Madagascar's resources while delivering little to its people. The new leadership didn't just suspend those contracts, they announced plans to renegotiate them entirely, prioritizing Malagasy ownership and local employment. It wasn't just political repair, it was psychological healing. For decades, Malagasy citizens had been told that their future depended on Western goodwill, on aid, on investment, on external validation. But now, for the first time in a generation, the narrative has flipped. The nation was talking about self-sufficiency, about generating its own power, processing its own raw materials, and educating its own engineers instead of exporting them. The revolution had permitted people to believe in their own capacity, yet the greatest transformation wasn't in government offices or policy drafts. It was in the collective consciousness. The youth no longer spoke about leaders as saviors. They spoke about systems as responsibilities. The word citizen began to carry weight again. Even the army, so often the villain in Africa's post-colonial politics, found itself redefined, not as an instrument of fear, but as a shield of accountability. Colonel Andry Rajoelina's restraint had earned the respect of a continent, but his next move would determine whether that respect turned into legacy or disappointment. Outside observers, especially in the West, began to predict failure. They said the transition would crumble, that the army would overstay its welcome, that chaos was inevitable. But the Malagasy people had already stopped caring about Western predictions. They were too busy learning to govern themselves. To them, even failure under self-rule was more dignified than success under dependency. By December, new initiatives began to take root. Agricultural programs prioritized local farmers over foreign investors. Tech collectives led by university graduates started developing renewable energy microgrids. Neighborhood councils met weekly to discuss resource distribution. None of it was perfect, but it was real. The revolution had left something more powerful than order behind: momentum. And that momentum carried a quiet truth, that the end of one regime doesn't automatically deliver paradise, but it opens the door to something rare in modern Africa: the possibility of authentic nationhood. Madagascar wasn't yet stable, it wasn't rich yet, but it was awake. And in a continent still fighting the ghosts of empire, awakening is the rarest victory of all. For now, the lights were flickering back on, not the kind powered by imported fuel, but the kind that burns from within. Do you think Madagascar's youth can protect their revolution from being hijacked by the same elites they overthrew? Let us know in the comments section. Is Africa finally learning that real independence begins when you stop asking for validation from the West? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.